at that'sjustsmart.com. Today we're talking with Wayne Johnson and we're taking on, or rather exploring, the current APS tax that's proposed. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for joining us today.
Good to be
How
here.
are you?
Doing very well, thank you very much.
Good. Can you give our listeners some background on you for those that aren't familiar with you?
Sure, quickly, I was Bernalillo County Commissioner for almost 8 years, also a small business owner, and just recently left the state auditor's office. I was the state auditor for 13 months.
Is it fair to say that you have a familiarity with property taxes?
I have a familiarity with property taxes, and I think it's fair to say the budgetary process from a local government standpoint in particular.
Wonderful. And that's what we're going to talk to you about today. Can you explain to our listeners how a property tax is assessed?
Well, that's about a 4-hour question, but actually there are a number of components. The first is the assessed value of your property. So any real property, whether that's your house or a commercial building, you have an assessed value. That assessed value is then reduced by about a third to a taxable assessed value. And that taxable assessed value is then multiplied by the total mills, or the mills that are imposed by the various government entities within a county, and then collected by the county. So those numbers or those dollars are then collected by the county twice a year.
And when these taxes are being changed by an entity, can you describe that process?
It's a legislative process in the city of Albuquerque, Bernalillo County, APS, AMAFCA, a number of other entities all have taxation authorities that are granted by the legislature itself. So each entity has a specific taxation authority that's set by the legislature. And they can, in a couple of different ways, impose taxes. One way is they have a self-imposed rate that they can impose in any increment. Sometimes it's specified by the statute, other times it's not. So they can impose that millage. The other part is what voters are more familiar with, is where you actually go out and impose a mill on yourself as taxpayers. So the legislative body, whether it's a school board or whether it's a county commission, goes out and asks the public to self-impose an additional mill that they would then pay on their property taxes.
So is a property tax and a mill the same thing, or are they different?
People are thinking of the property tax as the check they write, and the mill is the amount. It's a value per $1,000 that's imposed by a government entity across in a local government setting, and even the state has its own millage. Then multiplied by the net taxable value of the property. That is the check that is the tax at the end of the day.
And what kind of properties do these taxes apply to?
Residential and commercial. That's primarily what we're talking about here today.
And we want to talk a little bit about the APS tax proposal that is up for this upcoming election. And for our listeners, those ballots will be mailed out to you on January 8th. You will need to return them shortly thereafter by February 6th. So with regards to this APS tax proposal, are you familiar with those ballot questions?
I am familiar with it. I've got one sitting right in front of me, as a matter of fact, the sample ballot. Yeah.
Wonderful. And sample ballots are available on the APS website. So let's talk about this proposal that APS is seeking at this time. Can you describe for our listeners and our viewers here what it is, in your words, that APS is asking?
Well, they're asking for more of your money. In short, that's what they're doing. The normal process, you'll hear a lot of this, and it kind of drives me a little crazy, but you'll hear, this will not raise your taxes. And that's usually when bonds are ending their life cycle and they're asking you to reimpose the mills so that they can reissue the bonds. That's the typical process. And it's something to remember. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. What they're asking here is twofold. One, they're asking for you to reimpose an existing mill rate to support debt, and they're asking to increase it. All right, so that's the House Bill 33. That's the second mill levy question, and that is actually an increase in your taxes. Now the concern with this is, and I've kind of touched on it a minute ago, is that once you've self-imposed a mill to collect taxes for a local government entity, they're going to come back to you and want to reissue those bonds. If you don't approve them, your taxes will go down. If you do approve them, they will continue. So this isn't just about the 6 years that you're looking at for House Bill 33. This is almost in perpetuity, because it takes almost an act of God for the voters to not reimpose a mill. And in my estimation, APS doesn't need the additional funds, and they shouldn't need if they've been engaged in appropriate planning and if they've been fiscally responsible.
So let's talk a little bit about APS's budget. My understanding, and also it's available through the APS website and other public resources, APS has kind of two sources of funding. One is what they've called their operational budget and another is their capital outlay. Can you describe the difference for our followers?
Well, it's relatively simple. I mean, you pretty much described it. Your operational budget has its own set of revenue sources, and in APS's case, it comes primarily from the legislature, and that flows through the funding formula that's set by statute and then comes to APS. That's about almost 700 million, 670 some odd $million in operational budget. It goes to salaries, benefits, paper clips, those types of things needed to administer the school district. The rest of the budget, it's about $600 million. That makes up their capital budget. And these are budgets or budgetary items that go to build schools and buy capital, everything from computers to schools to cars to tangible property that you can put your hands on. And so together that budget comes down to about $1.3 billion.
Now these two different sources, the operational source or the capital outlay source, is APS able to cross-use them or mix them together? Can they just throw it into one big pot and use it however they want, or are there restrictions on their use?
Each funding source has restrictions on how they're to be used, and they're different depending on the source. You've got your operational budget that comes from the legislature. That is going to be restricted to operational type items, salaries, benefits, etc. In this particular ballot, you're seeing an SB 9 mill levy, which is a specialized authorization for APS to impose mills for a 6-year period, and you have the HB 33 mill levy, and these HBs, they refer to the original Senate bill and House bill where these funding sources were created. In essence, the legislature said, APS, you have the authority under these statutes to impose taxes, property taxes in this case, on the public within your district. And that's what they're asking you to authorize. Now, they did put some caveats in there, and you'll see it on the sample ballot. If you look at the original authorization, you'll see that it has to be used for capital projects, computers, buildings, maintenance, that sort of thing. It's pretty broad, frankly. It's almost anything that has to do with maintenance of a building or the creation of a building and or furniture and transportation vehicles and that sort of thing, capital concepts. But they can't use it for other things like teacher salaries. Those are specifically restricted to the capital projects, and each one of them varies a little bit when you look at them, but generally speaking, the two that are on the ballot are for capital improvements.
So the ballot actually has 3 questions.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question addresses the mill levy in Senate Bill 9, which looks like it's $190 million over 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
So with regards to that one, have you had a chance to look at it, its wording?
I've looked at it, and what it looks like to me, and I want to couch this a little bit. I'm going to hedge, figure that. What it looks like to me is that the $190 million over 6 years, this is a typical reauthorization where you're hearing people tell you, it won't raise your taxes because it's not asking for more than I'm able to determine than what was already imposed. And it is at the end of its life cycle. So it's at the end of its 6-year life cycle. They're asking to move forward and reapprove this money.
So they want to do, so that previously the voters had already approved it.
Right.
They're asking the voters to approve it now a second time.
Right, that is correct. Or this may not be just the second time. It may
But
be the
again.
third or fourth or whatever.
Okay.
And that's kind of the problem I was alluding to. This is that if you pass this, your taxes won't go up. But if you pass this, your taxes will not go down. Absolutely will not go down.
And it's for 6 years. Does that mean that in 6 years the voters are going to be given the same thing again to look at?
They would have to be, or the tax rate would no longer be authorized by the public, and your mill would actually go down, which means the check that you write for property taxes would likewise go down.
Okay. And then what about the second question that's being presented on the ballot? Have you looked at that?
This one I'm looking at, and it appears to be the one where the tax increase takes place, and it's under HB 33. They initially had authorized this, the public authorized it in 2016, so it's not at the end of its life cycle. It has a currently imposed rate of 3.838 mils for residential property and 4.344 mils for commercial property. They're asking for about a 25% increase in millage. It doesn't translate to your check directly, but in the mill rate, they're asking for about a 25% increase. This is where the new revenue is being generated. And they're doing it about 2 years in or 3 years into the original authorization. So this is where the increase looks like it's coming from.
Now, with property taxes, isn't there already an increase that residential and commercial owners face on an annual basis?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, in most cases. And this is the place where if you're an insomniac, pay perfect attention. I'll put you to sleep in about 3 minutes. The fact of the matter is you have in property taxes in the state of New Mexico an assessed value cap of 3%. And that's for only residential properties. Commercial properties it doesn't apply to, but for residential properties you have a 3% cap. That 3% cap means that your assessed value can't go up more than 3% per year. And that was originally designed to keep your grandmother or people on fixed incomes in their homes, all right, for a good purpose, I think. But that also created a situation called tax lightning, referred to by the legislators as tax lightning, is when that house is sold, the valuation goes to current and correct on that property. Now you have somebody in their house for 60 years and they're not paying much in the way of taxes. And the house next door that was built the same year, in the same development, same assessed value, same floor plan, is going to have taxes that are 3, 4, 5, 6 times higher than the house next door. So there are equities built into it. The other side of this, and this is the part that will really put you to sleep, is something called yield control. And yield control was created back in the late 70s, 1979 I believe was when they created it. And it was created for the same purpose, only inflation was the item that everybody was fighting at the time. Inflation was about 13% or something like that in 1979. So they created yield control. And what yield control said was that a government, a local government, needs X amount of dollars to operate every year, and that next year it's going to cost X plus some additional value. And that is called, they have a formula that they create and add X amount of money to every tax value. Now that will actually change the mill that's imposed by the local government and or body that has that is subject to yield control. And if you have a shrinking valuation like we did starting in about 2008 of property tax valuation, and you have a situation where you got the 3% cap, it'll actually increase the mill to compensate for the taxes that aren't being paid to make sure that that entity receives X plus a little bit more. It's called a growth control formula that they create. That's the X more or the Y more that you have to get every year. So if you're still with me and awake, it's a scheme to be able to pull to make sure the government is fully funded plus a little bit more every year, and it ends up costing you more every year.
Now, after those increases or those adjustments are made, what's being proposed here in the second part of the ballot is that in addition to already these accommodations and adjustments that are made here in Albuquerque.
Right, and they're trying to tell you that be careful about this language, because they're trying to tell you that they haven't asked for a tax increase for 12 years. Well, that presupposes something that I think is fallacious to begin with. First of all, it presupposes the tax increases are inevitable and that they're justified in every case. It also ignores the revenue equation. In other words, they are receiving more money today than they did 12 years ago due to the 3% guaranteed increase and yield control on top of that, and the fact that values keep going up. And that's probably over time, values always go up. So the amount of money that they're receiving is more today than it was 12 years ago when they last asked for a tax increase. So just saying we haven't asked for it presupposes A, that they should get it, and B, that they're not receiving more revenue today than they did 12 years ago. So it's self-adjusting. It's a little bit like having a cost of living increase for governments. They've already got it built in, it's baked into the system. So whenever you've got a government like this coming to you and saying, well, we haven't had an increase in 12 years, they're trying to mislead you with that terminology. Yes, costs have increased, but some of that is due to statutory requirements like Little Davis-Bacon that requires APS to spend 25% more on every project that they build, every capital project, every school, than the prevailing market rate would for a private company.
So you make a good point. There are some supporters that have indicated that there haven't been a tax, that APS has not asked for a tax increase for several years. The other argument that's floating around there is that all the construction projects that APS is undergoing have an increased cost now associated with them. Part of that is the Little Davis-Bacon. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's part of it. Part of it is increased cost for everything. But they're not talking about the revenue that they're receiving. And if you go and you look at their budget over time, you will see their capital budget has increased because the revenue has increased. Their taxes, the rate imposed hasn't increased, but the actual revenue generated by the imposed rates has increased. And in that case, they are receiving the cost of living adjustments that they're saying that this additional tax is being imposed, or they're asking you to impose to accommodate for.
So they've actually already been getting this increase that they're asking for.
And if they had been fiscally responsible and not done some of the things that I think people look back over time. I mean, I'm thinking about the Montgomery complex over there. I'm not sure that you could justify really building that staff-only building at Comanche and Louisiana. There's not a single student that will be taught in that facility, and yet they build a brand new, huge complex over there. How many students or how many buildings or how many schools could actually have been repaired or upgraded with the money that went into that one facility? They built a second, not on the old Del Norte site at Montgomery and San Mateo. They built a new Del Norte and a second school on that same property. And what we're seeing in APS is a decline in enrollment. And that piece of property, from a real estate perspective, is one of the most valuable pieces of property in the state. If you'd sold that, how many other schools could you have remodeled, upgraded, roofs repaired, etc.? They're not always wise with their money, and that's typical for government. Government likes to buy things; they don't like to sell things. Okay, that's always the way it works. And in the case of APS, has a long history. In fact, they're the poster child for building a brand new or buying a brand new building and never selling any property that they plan to sell, to consolidate their operational costs and reduce those costs. Instead, those operational costs have gone up. When you build a new building, you have to staff it. That's what government does. And every time you build something that's new, that is not in existence at the time, then you have to find people to staff it. Your operational costs go up, your salaries and benefits go up, your unfunded liabilities for retirement goes up, for the pension and ERB, all of those costs go up. So be very careful before you give any local government, any government, additional money to build new buildings.
And where this money goes is important. I'm a mom, I have a student in APS, so knowing that the money would go to my son's classroom or with other students' classroom would sound like it'd be a great benefit, and that's what I'm hearing, for the proponents of this tax, is that my son will directly benefit. His teacher can get more money, there'll be more supplies in the classroom, and all this stuff will be great directly to the students, but it's not sounding like that's really the case when you look at the wording on the ballot. Is that correct?
Well, these are capital projects, and from what APS is telling us, these are going to be used for more buildings now, maintenance and that sort of thing. That's perfectly appropriate, but it's not to maintain. It's not necessarily to buy books for students. By the way, you shouldn't be using bond money to buy books. You shouldn't be using bond money to buy vehicles. You shouldn't be using bond money to buy things like, well, I said vehicles, but you shouldn't, computers. Computers are terrible. And bonds it's basically taking out a loan. And the lifetime or lifespan of a vehicle, a book, or a computer, they're minuscule these days. You've got a year to 18 months on any average computer that you buy. I mean, how many different phones have you gone through in the last few years? That is an expensive way to fund it because you're paying for interest on top of the actual cost. So you're not getting the bang for your buck that you should be getting. You want, for anything you bond out, you want to be have a long life. A building is a great bonding opportunity. There are those that don't think that's a good idea either, that should be paid outright. But I think you've got to strike a balance and make sure that the lifespan of whatever you're bonding is in excess of the actual bond itself. Otherwise, you're paying interest on something that is no longer useful and not being used.
So this is kind of the equivalent of getting a 30-year mortgage on a cell phone that you'll have to turn in about a year.
It's an exact equivalent to what's going on, and government does it all the time.
So the last part of this ballot is a GO bond. Can you explain to our followers what that is?
This is the actual authorization of $200 million in debt. So they can go out and sell $200 million worth of bonds based on probably a number of different funding sources to support these bonds. Probably SB 9, HB 33 money would be used in that as well. So this is the actual loan that they're asking for at this point. When you're asking for $510 million over 6 years and $190 million over 6 years, you're probably going to end up with additional GO bond questions going forward, where they will ask you for additional authority to go into further debt.
So this sounds like they're asking for a lot of money from the Bernalillo County residents and those that attend APS schools. You're familiar with our population here.
Sure.
You've served here specifically in this county for several years and have lived here longer. So what kind of people are we looking being adversely impacted by all this debt that they're asking us to accumulate now?
First and foremost, anybody that owns property, real property. That's buildings, houses, residential, that sort of thing. And folks will say, well, I rent my house. Well, good for you. You rent your house. You do pay property taxes. There's a little thing called a triple net lease. It's a common instrument for renting properties, and it saves the property owner from having to absorb unanticipated tax increases, property tax increases, GRT increases. What that means is they're passing any tax increase on the property that you're renting, whether that's an apartment or a house or anything else, straight onto you. And that's the case with all taxes. Taxes are passed down the chain until you get to the consumer, who has nobody else to pass that tax on to. And that's the same thing here. So if you're on a fixed income, it definitely hurts you. So the older Americans on Social Security, that sort of thing, you're going to get hit right off the bat. Even with the 3% caps, you're going to see an increase in your taxes because the mill went up, and that's how that calculation goes. Millennials, people out there trying to buy their first home. Well, you do a tax calculation. If you've ever gotten a mortgage, most of the time they collect as part of your payment every month an escrow payment. That escrow is used to pay your taxes for this property. And so you will be hit.